Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was adopted by Uchiha Mikoto. Uchiha Mikoto takes the hand of an outcast child, and with it rewrites the destiny of her clan. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 15. While Mikoto had been carving away support for the coup from the inside, the Hokage and a few trusted advisors been working feverishly on their plan to eliminate Madara. A few weeks after Uchiha Takuma's funeral, and the covered meeting that had taken place after, she donned the Umbu mask again and stole into the Hokage's tower under the starlight. She was intensely curious to meet this intellect the Hokage had obliquely referred to the last time they'd spoken, the man who would have a chance at outmaneuvering Madara. She landed gracefully on the staircase spiraling around the top floors, and rose from her crouch. Unlike the last time, Deus Hero wasn't here to meet her. But someone was lounging against the balcony railing, his arms crossed indolently across his chest. He yawned loudly, and at length, then unfolded himself from the slouch. He nodded at her. He smelled faintly like a stable, and, if he hadn't been wearing a flak jacket under his ragged leather coat, she could have been forgiven for assuming he was a vagrant. "You're rather late, Mikoto-san," he said, in a gravelly baritone. "Shall we, then?" Her henge was flawless. He must have been expecting her, and been told how she'd be disguising herself. She took a few steps forward, and as she did so the cloud obscuring the full moon passed it by. "Shikaku-san," she said, recognition arriving with the brighter moonlight. "You're attending the meeting with the Hokage?" He shrugged. "I was roped into it somehow," he said, as he ducked into the doorway. Mikoto followed, and dropped the henge, once the door had shut behind them. "If I'd known being Jonin commander was going to involve this many late nights, I never would have signed on. I was hoping for a nice, relaxing desk job in my old age." Mikoto stopped in her tracks. "You're the new Jonin commander?" she asked, incredulous. The Senjoku no Ichi who had previously held the post had just announced her retirement due to poor health. Nara Shikaku hadn't been on the short list of candidates to replace her. She didn't think he'd been on any list. He had no special qualities that would have recommended him for a position of such authority. As a shinobi he was stunningly average, except for how thoroughly his wife Yoshino had him wrapped around her finger. And she was only mostly sure he was joking about the overtime. "Officially, I am as of next week," he explained. "In light of the current situation, the Hokage had me starting a little early." He led her to a small conference room in the top level, and turned the handle. "Ladies first." There were 8 men seated at the low table, already deep in discussion. The Hokage was at its head, Jiraiya on his right and Itachi at his left. Mikoto and Shikaku settled themselves into the empty places next to Deus Hero. One of the Umbu captains, a hulking man whose mask was adorned with a pair of bull's horns, turned to her. "Begging your pardon, Uchiha-sama," he said, obviously continuing a point their entrance had interrupted, "but I do not understand why we must put the whole village at risk, if sacrificing a small part of it could ensure the safety of the whole." "Because there is no safety as long as Madara lives," the Hokage said, with total certainty. "His goal is not to assist his clansmen in achieving their revolution. It is to destroy Konoha entirely. The Uchiha are depending on their alliance with Kiri to protect them from the worst of Kumo's aggression. If their assassination attempt were to succeed, it is my belief that Madara will have the Mizukage pull out of that alliance at the most catastrophic time. Konoha would be overrun. If it did not succeed, he would spring another trap around us. Not now, perhaps, but soon enough. We know he concocts plans, within plans in his quest for vengeance. He tried 7 years ago, and more Uchiha died defending the village from the Kyuubi than shinobi from any other clan. Although Minato foiled that attempt, Madara ensured they would be weakened as a clan, and that the seeds of dissent would be planted when he tried again. Sacrificing the Uchiha may buy Konoha a little time, but it won't prevent the inevitable. And I also am deeply concerned with this Akatsuki organization he is assembling, especially its interest in Uzumaki Naruto. The next time he tries, I doubt we will have the benefit of a warning, and it is also likely he will have assembled a roster of very powerful allies," the Hokage finished. Which is why we must strike now, Itachi put in. We tear out Madara's influence by the roots, and then we kill him. The Uchiha beyond his reach have as much invested in keeping Konoha whole as any of you. Their ancestors accepted the Senju alliance, and they chose to have him exiled. Without their assistance there would be no Konoha. The dissenting Umbu captain did not seem pleased to be brought to task by a 13-year-old, but his arguments subsided. Shikaku-san, the Hokage said. Now that Mikoto-san has joined us, I am interested to learn what you plan to do with these. He placed the metallic sphere he had been toying with carefully at the center of the table. Mikoto looked at it dubiously. They looked superficially like the smoke bombs many shinobi carried to cover a retreat, although larger. They might bring down visibility a little, but not enough to make much difference. It's too easy to dispel the smoke, she said. They're not your standard ninja tools, Shikaku corrected. The daimyo's police forces use them for riot control in Earth Country. Each canister is filled with a chemical that's aerosolized upon detonation. The gas causes severe eye irritation and temporary blindness. Hurts like hell, or so I've been told, but it's not lethal. We can modify Umbu masks to seal against the face, and attach the air filters they use in Ame. That would be adequate to disable the rebels' Sharingan. The Hokage asked Mikoto. Yes, she answered, surprised. Unlike the Hyuga, we can't see through our own eyelids. It should work. Mikoto thought it was a stroke of genius, and her respect for the man jumped up a notch. When fighting an Uchiha, you had two real options. 3 if you considered, beg for mercy, a strategy bring the area visibility down to 0, or blind them. For obvious reasons, the first option was almost as much of a handicap to the other shinobi as it was to their Uchiha opponent. But the second could work. Years ago, she herself had almost been killed by a Mirchinin armed with nothing more than a handful of hot ashes and a single kunai. Once the rebels are incapacitated, the Umbu teams, and their Uchiha escorts, will move in to make the arrests. Your brother provided us a detailed map of the Loyalists' residences, Shikaku said, gesturing in Mikoto's direction with his chin, and also suggested we make use of safe houses where the very old, the very young, and the ill will be taking shelter. A healthy adult recovers fairly quickly from the corrosive effects of the gas, but I don't want to push our luck with it. A dead kid is the absolute last thing I want out of this. After we've rounded up the suspects, we'll run them by the Yamanaka for deep mind probes. Anyone that fails, or refuses to submit, will be executed as traitors. Objections? The Hokage asked. No one gave them. Good. Now, this will do us no good if Madara still lives. Wolf, if you would. Itachi sat up a little straighter, keenly conscious of his youth compared to everyone else in the room. Madara possesses the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, he said. He has mastered all of the Katon techniques favored by the Uchiha, as well as Jakuken ninjutsu. His prowess exceeds that of the Yondaime by an enormous margin. He doesn't require even a single hand seal to activate any of them. The jutsu is capable of teleporting him to any familiar location, or rendering his body intangible and impervious to damage. His genjutsu is enormously powerful, enough to hold a lesser Biju under his thrall for an extended period of time. His chakra reserves may rival that of a Jinchuriki. Additionally, he seems to be in possession of an immortality jutsu which... You can't be serious, interrupted a man in a boar mask. No one is that strong. He must be bluffing. No, Itachi said coldly. He is not. But even so, he is not invulnerable, Shikaku put in. I have been briefed on all available intelligence concerning Madara, both from Itachi-san's interaction with him, and historical records from the time predating the village's founding. With this information, I have formulated a strategy to defeat him. Mikoto caught herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue. He has two major goals, one of which he has stated plainly, and another which can be extrapolated from his actions thus far. The first, as you already know, is to wipe Konoha from the map. I believe the second is to collect several, or possibly all 9, Jinchuriki. He is in possession of 2 so far, the puppet Mizukage, vessel of the Sanbei, and presumably the Kirigaku or Genin Yotakata, vessel of the Rokubai. According to Itachi-san, the surrender of the Kyuubi was a critical piece of the negotiations the Uchiha conducted in secret with Kiryu. In order to accomplish his first goal, he will first have to bring Naruto-kun to safety, or he risks killing its vessel in the chaos. Even he can't control a freed Kyuubi for long. That he has not done so already indicates he either cannot locate Naruto-kun easily, or cannot transport him out of the village. Itachi-san has again corroborated this theory, Shikaku said, with dip of his head towards him. When I requested his assist for the supposed massacre of the Uchiha, he asked me specifically whether or not the Naka shrine was the same as it had been in his time. He was adamant that I meet him there, Itachi said. It seems he cannot enter Konoha through any other route. Nor can he teleport in safely. The Konoha he knew was barely more than a glorified military encampment. So much has changed he risks rematerializing halfway through a wall. The shrine is one of the oldest buildings in Konoha, and the only one he remembers clearly enough to use as an anchor. In the course of my research I uncovered a very old seal inscription integrated into the base of the detection barrier around Konoha, Shikaku continued. The current barrier team knew only that it was placed by Uzumaki Mito-sama, and were unaware of its true purpose, but have faithfully maintained it regardless. As it happens, they have probably saved all of our lives. It is an instant kill seal keyed to Madara's chakra. The Shodai knew he'd return to wreak havoc after being banished. If he attempted to set foot through the gates, he'd be vaporized. With this in mind, I propose we remove Naruto-kun to a remote, secure location, and keep him there until the conclusion of this operation. He looked to Jiraiya. With the permission of the Toad clan, Mount Mayabuka would be ideal. Consider it given, Jiraiya said immediately. The boss liked Minato even more than he likes me. If he knew Madara was messing with his kid, he'd try to flatten the bastard himself. Don't think he'd mind if Naruto brought a friend, either, he said, pointedly, to Mikoto. I was hoping you'd say that, Mikoto said, with relief. Once he realizes Itachi has betrayed him, I was afraid he might go after Sasuke to cut his losses. Shikaku nodded with satisfaction. With Naruto-kun safely hidden, knowledge of his whereabouts will be our bait to draw Madara into the trap. And once that's occurred? Bor asked. How the hell are we supposed to kill someone we can't even touch? Shikaku gave him a lopsided smile. I keep a step or 5 ahead of everyone. Madara is no exception. His entire existence centers on one thing: vengeance. In any given situation, he may be relied upon to take the option that offers the least risk to himself, while simultaneously causing the most physical or emotional pain to an individual he believes has wronged him. If he were to come across someone who has knowledge of where Naruto is being held, I'm certain he would attempt to torture it out of them. His Tsukuyomi, a genjutsu that implants memories of days of torture in the span of seconds, is the ideal means to this end. The only requirement, besides the main Jikyo Sharingan, is eye contact. This genjutsu is for all practical purposes unbreakable, and, when released, leaves the victim mentally incapacitated permanently. However, it does have one weakness. Because of the intensity of the technique, he enters the illusion along with his victim, and his entire awareness is focused inward to create and implant the memories. For the few seconds the genjutsu takes to perform, he cannot maintain any Kagebunshin, he is blind and deaf to the world, and his body is tangible. If a killing blow were to be delivered in this window, Madara could be defeated. This strategy requires a solitary operative, and a platoon of 6, one of the platoon to act as bait, a solitary operative to perform the assassination, and the rest to protect the one baiting Madara until he engages the target. With Jiraiya-sama's assistance, we can rig a summoning seal keyed to the assassin to activate the moment Madara's target is put under the genjutsu. They will have at most 3 seconds to destroy his body. The Hokage chewed on his pipe, and then removed it to exhale a cloud of smoke. Hound. You will perform the assassination. Choose your second, and your 4 best men to fill out the team. He closed his eyes briefly. I open the floor to volunteers for the final position. Itachi rose immediately. A man in a dolphin mask was about to follow him, but Mikoto shot to her feet before he was out of a crouch. Every mask in the room turned to stare at her. Itachi, she said. Sit down. I outrank you, and I refuse, he said evenly. Mikoto ground her teeth, and addressed the Hokage. I apologize, sir, but may we be excused to discuss this matter in private? The Hokage nodded, and indicated a side door half concealed by a hanging tapestry. Mikoto walked past the kneeling Umbu members. Itachi sighed and followed her. It opened into a narrow, windowless corridor with weak electric lights lining the ceiling. When the heavy door swung closed, Mikoto pushed her mask up to her forehead, and Itachi did the same. I won't let you, she said fiercely. I won't let you face him alone. That is my choice to make. I am Umbu. Despite your participation in this mission, you are not. Why would that matter? She said. We took the same oath. I'm as capable of performing this duty as you are. I'm not questioning your ability, he said. You are a more skilled shinobi than I ever would have thought. But this is a suicide mission. Or something even worse, if that is possible. His voice dropped even lower. I've seen his victims, mother. A senior Kiri Jonin, Mamakai Karbana, was implicated in a plot to provoke a rebellion against the Yondaime Mizukage. Whether she was truly guilty I do not know, but she is kept chained to the wall of the Mizukage's audience chamber, nearly catatonic and covered in filth. The key to her monocles is hanging around her neck. Until she retired, she was a member of the Seven Swordsmen, and even she hadn't enough of a mind left after the Tsukuyomi to free herself. I will not allow anyone to sacrifice themselves this way for my sake, especially you. Mikoto brought her gloved hands up to cradle his face, turning it back to her when he drew away. Itachi, I've failed to protect you so many times, she whispered. Give me this. Please. You have your whole life spreading out in front of you, and I don't think I could live with myself if I failed you this final time. Itachi bowed his head, shut his eyes. No, he whispered. The Uchiha will need you. The village will need you. How can you serve them if you've already thrown your life away? Sasuke needs his mother, he said stubbornly. Sasuke has you. When you were little, you used to tell me that you would always be there to protect him, no matter what happened. And you did. You were the one who carried him safely to the shelters, when the Kyuubi attacked. You watched over him when he started weapons practice, and then his first ninjutsu. You forced a promise from the entire Konoha Council to spare his life, no matter what happens to the rest of us. And more than that, he loves you. After long moments, he nodded his consent. All right, he said, nearly inaudible, turning his face away, and pulling down the mask to conceal his features. The task is yours. He pulled open the door, to rejoin the conference, as Mikoto resettled her own mask. She knelt at her place, every man waiting patiently. Hokage-sama, with your permission, I will take the final position, Mikoto said, her voice hard. Madara will likely know that I've been looking after Naruto. This plan has the greatest chance of success if one of the clan head's family is the one to confront him. That is your final decision? The Hokage asked. It is, sir. And, if you believe I am capable of this duty, Itachi added, I request that you allow me to serve as the mission leader, and perform the assassination. There has never been an Umbu captain as young as you are in the history of Konoha, the Hokage pointed out. That is true, Kakashi said, speaking up for the first time. But the Umbu Code itself states that neither age nor rank should have any bearing on the decision to promote a member, only their mission record and the recommendation of their team captain. He may not have much of a record yet, but he was my subordinate, and I officially recommend you promote him. The Hokage's eyebrows arched, but he nodded. Then I trust your judgment. Wolf, as of now, you have the rank of Umbu squad captain. Choose your team in consultation with Hound, and submit your selections as soon as possible. Unless there are any additional questions, you are dismissed. He rose carefully, and pinned Mikoto with a meaningful glance. Please meet me in my office. I have something to discuss with you in private. The one in the badger mask stopped her with a hand on her shoulder while the others filed out behind the Hokage. Deus hero, she said, refusing to flinch from the touch. You don't have to do this, it's insane, he said, the concern in his voice unmuffled by the mask. Let one of us confront Madara. You haven't seen combat since the Kyuubi attacked. If there was a rank above S, this mission would be it. That's not possible, and you know it, she snapped, unjustly angry at him for prodding her already trembling resolve. Aside from Itachi, I have the strongest natural talent for genjutsu in the village. I have the best chance out of all of you of withstanding his Tsukuyomi. You're an Uchiha! He exclaimed. You know full well there's no withstanding that genjutsu. He'll shatter your mind, and I can't. You will, she said, cutting him off. You're a shinobi. You will. He let his hand slide from her shoulder, much too slowly, in a way that made her feel like she was 15 again. Daya's hero was the first boy she'd ever kissed, when they were young and stupid, and thought that love was something that could carry them through anything. She thought he'd given up that puppy crush the day of her wedding. Mikoto swallowed hard. For that matter, she thought she had. You should have applied for UMBU 13 years ago, he said. Spending all that time scrubbing floors for Fugaku was nothing short of a criminal waste. After he left, Mikoto stood silent in the empty room, just to breathe. She had a good idea of what the Hokage wished to discuss, and the thought of it constricted around her heart like the coils of a snake. She restored the henge of the green-haired UMBU operative, in case there were any aides scurrying about at this late hour, and strode the short distance to the Hokage's office. The door was open a crack, and there was no one else about, not even his bodyguards. She let herself in and locked the door behind her. The Hokage had his back to her, and was staring out over the darkened village. Your resolve continues to surprise me, Mikoto-san, he said. But perhaps it shouldn't. What a mother is willing to sacrifice for her children. She had no answer for him, she was still wrestling with the decision herself. There is, however, one more thing that must be addressed before we proceed with the operation, he said. Relations with the lower-ranking Uchiha may be repaired, if it comes to light they were manipulated. However, those directly responsible have committed treason, and must receive the corresponding punishment. The integrity of the village demands it. I cannot be perceived as forgiving of traitors, my mercy has already done Konoha enough harm. Mikoto swallowed around the tightness in her throat. That crime had only one sentence. Death. She probably wouldn't be able to change the Hokage's mind, even though the mistreatment of the Uchiha, and her husband's rebellion against it, had been based on a carefully orchestrated lie. After Orochimaru's secret laboratory had been discovered, and his hideous crimes had been laid bare, the Hokage couldn't bring himself to kill his wayward student. In the tunnels, UMBU had found his notes on experiments with the Shoda's pilfered remains, and the 59 little sapling trees that had taken root in 59 little blood-stained beds. Even after seeing the evidence with his own eyes, still the Hokage hadn't been able to carry out the sentence. He allowed Orochimaru to flee into exile. Spurred by his superior's failure to act, Shimura Danzo had taken it upon himself, initially creating root for the express purpose of hunting down and killing Orochimaru. That he later split the loyalty of UMBU, and destabilized the village in the process, was a direct result of that act of mercy. The Hokage turned his chair to face her. Someone close to the clan head would be the obvious choice. Fugaku knows I will be out for his blood, and protects himself accordingly. Currently only one of my agents would be able to get near him. No son should be forced to execute his own father, no matter how heinous his crimes, she said, her voice low. I know that personal feelings can't come before mission objectives for UMBU agents, but he's already been forced to murder his best friend. Please don't ask this of him too. He's so strong, stronger than both of us, but you know that would break him. What would you have me do? The Hokage asked, sadly. UMBU will be able to take the other council members, who are old and weak, but Fugaku is young enough to be in excellent fighting form, and experienced enough not to give an assassin an opening. Yet he must be taken down, and soon. Every day that goes by makes it more likely he will discover you intend to betray him. The Uchiha rebels are that aware one of their own is working against them. You don't have much time. Behind the porcelain mask, Mikoto bit down on her lip so hard it almost drew blood. Is there anything I can say that would convince you to spare his life? He served the village faithfully for almost 20 years. Do you think I'm unaware of what the Uchiha have done for Konoha? If there was any way to resolve this situation without executing your husband, I would have done so. If I show mercy to a traitor again, I have no doubt Danzo will attempt to push a vote of no confidence through the Jonin Council with whatever means he deems necessary. Far too many of the clan heads already believe I've gone soft in my old age. And after he's forced my resignation, and slipped something lethal and untraceable into my tea, you will then have to deal with a Hokage who truly does wish to grind the Uchiha into dust beneath his heel. She ground her teeth. The Hokage was right, damn him. And even if he did show her husband mercy, the man was so proud she was afraid he wouldn't take it. Danzo was too astute to let an opportunity like that pass by. There were two results from that course of action. A coup, or a massacre. Either way, Konoha would be devastated. Then I'll do it myself, if it must be done, she choked out. Infiltration and assassination was my area of expertise. Fugaku won't be able to bring himself to kill me, no matter what I've done. I'll be safe until I engage Madara. Your emotional investment is too great. I will not assign you this mission. And I won't let you force Itachi to murder his own father. Why should they have to pay the price for your mistake? The Hokage sighed deeply. If those words had come from anyone else's lips, they would find themselves charged with insubordination. He sat back in his chair, his gnarled hands clenched on the armrests. They shouldn't have to, he said softly, regret permeating his age-roughened voice. If I could take the burden entirely on myself, I would. Perhaps someday I will, but that day is not today, for the sake of the village and for your clan. Mikoto ignored the warning, and the apology. I swear to you the mission objectives will be carried out. But not that you won't interfere with an official Umbu operation. She kept silent. Very well, he said. Since there is nothing I could do short of imprisoning you to force your cooperation, go. Report here again the morning of the festival for Jiraiya to inscribe the seal. Chapter 16. The Enidaime's birthday dawned on a beautiful spring day, the sky a clear azure and the air scented with sakura blossoms. The village was bubbling with anticipation for the festival. By just after sunrise, the streets were already crowded with enterprising shop owners and gawking visitors from the country towns. Mikoto had seen the dawn creep over the mountain peaks curled up in the bench by her bedroom window. She hadn't slept. Her husband was going over last-minute preparations with the assault teams, and Itachi had disappeared to find his own peace. She'd let Sasuke stay up far past his usual bedtime, the school was closed for the holiday, and she needed him to sleep for a while longer. She stopped at his room before she left, pulled the door open a fraction. He was sleeping in a tangle of blankets, his arm thrown over his chest. She didn't wake him. It wasn't the time to say goodbye yet. She left the house with her shopping basket slung over her arm, in some horrible parody of her usual morning errands. Once she passed the borders of the Uchiha district, she wrapped herself in the henge of a sour-looking merchant's widow, and strode to the center of town. On her face she fixed an expression of distaste to scare away friendly conversation. There was a small army of rookie genin erecting food stalls and game stands. Customers were spilling out of the tiny open-air restaurants with handfuls of breakfast wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Even her glare wasn't enough to discourage the bravest of the hawkers, and finally she had to resort to taking the narrow alleys to the Hokage's tower instead. At the door, she let her Sharingan seep through the unremarkable brown eyes of the woman whose face she'd borrowed. The Chunin guarding the door ushered her inside. Festival days were a prime opportunity for a spy to slip unnoticed past the great gates. A large portion of Konoha's Umbu had been recalled to manage security for the event, and at this time of the morning the tower was thick with them, as they were distributed their assignments. One of the anonymous black cloaks peeled off from the rest, inclining her head slightly. She wore a freshly polished cat mask that looked too unblemished to have seen much action. "If you'll come with me, ma'am," she said, in a voice Mikoto knew very well. Mikoto fell into step behind the taller woman, still playing the part of the merchant's widow. Yojao led them to the lower levels of the structure, and then to a door with 3 seal tags pasted over the door and frame. A large orange restricted sign was riveted to the metal. She pressed her forefinger against each of the 3 seals in succession, and the paper glowed briefly and peeled back of its own accord. A utilitarian stairwell descended far down into the lower levels, probably deep into the bedrock. "You can drop the henge, we're in a secure area," Yojao said, once the heavy metal door had shut behind them. Jiraiya-sama is waiting for you, I'll take you to him. That was considerate. She now had a chaperone. She managed half a smile for Yojeo, whose response was concealed by her mask. They walked in silence through the chilly corridors. Yojeo stopped at an unmarked door, slightly ajar. Warm candlelight was seeping out around the jamb. She pushed it open, and indicated Mikoto enter. The room was a mess of notebooks, scrolls, and sake bottles. Jiraiya was sitting in the middle of it, next to the room's only piece of furniture, a low table, and sipping a cup of tea. Despite the evidence of a marathon of drinking that had taken place within the last few days, he looked perfectly alert. A brush, a well of slightly brownish ink, and a scrap with a rough sketch of a human form and a meticulously rendered seal inscription topped the piles of paper. I can find you anything you require from the Umbu quartermaster, Jiraiya-sama, Yojeo said. He drained the cup and set it on the table, rising with a grunt. I have everything I need, he answered. Yojeo nodded and knelt behind the door, unobtrusively ready to render any assistance required. Please, take off your shirt and lie down, he said. Don't mind me. Would it kill you to take this a little more seriously? She snapped. If I took every serious situation seriously I'd be as crazy as Orochimaru by now, he replied. Mikoto crossed her arms over her chest. You're sure there's no one else who could do this? Well, let me think, he said, tapping the brush against his chin. You need a fusion of two extremely complex, chakra-intensive seals, and screwing up the job could mean the end of Konoha as we know it. Nobody's coming to mind. Fine. Point made, Mikoto said crossly, and started untying the sash holding her long vest closed. But this had better not make it into one of those idiotic books of yours. Or I'll scramble your head so badly every pretty girl you try to peep on will turn into a sagging granny. On my honor, he said, mockingly solemn, then a little worried. Could you really do that? Do you really want to find out? Just tell me when you're all settled, he said meekly, and turned to face the wall. He cleared his throat. Please. Unexpectedly, that won a tiny smile out of her. For all of his carefully cultivated reputation as an incorrigible pervert, he was, oddly respectful of women, and Kunoichi in particular. With Tsunade as a teammate it was probably an ingrained survival tactic. He might take every opportunity to peer down a woman's cleavage, but hell, at least he appreciated their assets above eye level, too, which was more than could be said for a lot of men. And no woman had accused him of forcing himself on her against her will in the entirety of his long career. Since he'd served through 2 wars, this was really something. Konoha shinobi tended to be more respectful of civilians than average, but weren't wholly above theft and rape if they thought they could get away with it. Mikoto pulled off the vest and undershirt and unhooked her bra. She folded the clothes up in a neat pile and lay down on the floor, cushioning her head in her hands. The threat was an empty one, but he wasn't taking any chances, and he didn't even try to sneak a peek. Ready, she said. He picked up his inkwell, without any more jokes. He began at the base of her neck, with a single dab of his brush the slight protrusion of her vertebra. The liquid was warm, and smelled faintly of blood. Although she couldn't see what he was doing, she could feel it. The brush tickling her skin sketched out the skeleton of the design in elegant dashes of ink, radiating outward from her spine, always laying down his strokes in the direction of her chakra flow. The seal grew organically, whirl by whirl, and her appreciation for his skill rose tenfold. The synthesis of an advanced seal inscription was a painstaking exercise in draftsmanship rather than art, carefully measured and plotted with rulers and compasses. For the longest time, Kushina was the only person she knew that could wing it, and later, after a great deal of study, Minato was added to that very short list. Maybe his sensei had been listening in on the lessons. She'd barely slept the night before, and her eyelids were heavy by the time he finished the preparations, stood, and stretched out his back. Summoning seals are usually attached to paper, not people, he said. The infusion is going to hurt. A lot. Are you ready? Yes. He placed the fingertips of his right hand over her spine, directly over her heart, and pushed. Creating seals of this kind required massive chakra stores, to bend the very fabric of space to the seal master's will. The room was illuminated with dancing blue light, and every track of his brush over her skin was lit on fire. She clenched her teeth to keep from screaming, but it forced itself out anyway. After a second the glow faded, and the room was lit by the warm flame of the wall sconces once more. She barely dared to breathe, every movement stoked the fire on her back anew. "Shit. Don't move. We'll find you the medic." "Did it work?" she choked out. "Yeah. It worked," he said. "A little too well." Yojeo was already on her feet, and Mikoto heard the door open and close as she hurried down the hall to find someone to deal with her burns. 2 sets of footsteps returned in short order. "What the hell did you do to her?" asked the medic, as she knelt promptly beside Mikoto. "Look, I'm sorry," Jiraiya said. "I had to work fast. We didn't have time for a gradual infusion." "Can I give her a nerve block without disrupting the seal?" the woman asked. She sounded older, and had a throaty smoker's voice. He replied. The Umbu medic placed one finger at the base of her skull, and the pain iced over into a tingling numbness. She got to work, the infusion of her chakra into Mikoto's back as gentle as Jiraiya's had been overpowering. "I can heal you well enough to fight later, but you're going to have these scars for the rest of your life." Mikoto felt something catch in her throat. The woman was being awfully optimistic if she thought Mikoto was going to be in a position to care. "I don't care how it looks. Get me as close to healed as you can, as fast as you can." The woman grunted her approval, and continued her work in silence. When she finished, the medic helped her rise slowly into a sitting position. The woman wore no cloak and a dough mask topped with close-cropped black hair. Mikoto didn't know her. Jiraiya had conscientiously turned to study a sketch pinned to the wall with great fascination. Satisfied with her work, the medic helped her dress with professional detachment. Nerve blocks as tight as hers took some time to wear off, and Mikoto's fingers were too numb and clumsy for fine manipulations. The skin of her back felt tight and itchy, but it wouldn't impede her fighting ability. "We're done," Mikoto said. "You can turn around." Jiraiya looked around his shoulder hesitantly, and then turned to face them. The medic got to her feet, inclined her head slightly in Mikoto's direction, and went back to her post. "The seal has 2 charges," Jiraiya explained once she'd gone. "One to test the summoning once she's under a genjutsu, and one for the real deal." "Where's Itachi-san?" "With the Hokage," Yojeo answered. "Would you do the honors, Umbu-san?" Jiraiya asked. "I'm not a genjutsu type. Anything would do." Mikoto stood, shaking out her skirts. Yojeo nodded and performed a few hand seals. Mikoto felt the room spin slightly, and in place of the dark figure kneeling by the door was a girl of about 10 or 11, with solemn brown eyes and a bob of violet hair. On her right was a slightly chubby boy a few years older, with pouches of medical tools slung over each hip. He grinned at her. On her left was a girl with a katana strapped to her back, chewing a piece of gum and wearing her boyish mien with languid defiance. The younger Yojeo smiled faintly at Mikoto, although a few tears had begun to slip down her cheeks. "Thank you for everything, sensei," she murmured. As she spoke there was a rush of air and a curl of smoke. Itachi appeared in the midst of it, his back against hers. He stumbled a little as if dizzy, then righted himself. "Your seal appears to be successful," he said, addressing Jiraiya in a detached voice. "I have never been the subject of a Kuchi Yasei no Jutsu before. It was disorienting. I will adjust for it during the actual operation. The second time isn't as bad," he said. "Believe me, the toads have put me through the ringer with those." The reassurance fell flat, and Itachi ignored his attempt at humor. "I'll just be going, then," he said, with uncomfortable chuckle. Yojeo inclined her head faintly, and followed him out. Itachi turned on his heels to look at Mikoto. "You should be heading back home," he said. "Father may return." She nodded her understanding, but didn't move to leave, not yet. This would be the last time they had alone until... Itachi realized it only a little after she did. He tensed, but nevertheless reached gently for her shoulder, towing forbidden ground. He hadn't crossed that self-imposed borderline since his first kill 5 years ago. The day he had decided his mother had failed him. She kept still, and didn't rush him. His embrace was tentative and awkward, as if he expected his body to fit in different places, his arms around her waist and his head pillowed on her chest. She returned it with force, in equal parts joy and grief. "Quit Umbu as soon as your contract is over," she said quietly. "It's not for you. Life as an assassin will drive you mad." She exhaled slowly against the collar of his Jonin vest. "You'd be a good teacher. Apply for a genin team when you're a little older. Konoha has enough cold-hearted assassins. Show them it's possible to live as a shinobi without giving up the people you love." "I will," he replied. She backed away, her head down. If I survive, please don't let Sasuke see it. I want him to remember me as I am now. He'll want to be at your side. I can't promise that. Itachi, please. He'll have to come to understand the sacrifices a shinobi must make, and, judging by how quickly he's advancing, it will be sooner rather than later. I would rather he do it surrounded by family and friends, than in some battlefield," he said, and added softly. "We won't be able to protect him forever." Sasuke resettled the straps of his pack on his shoulders. "Why are we going to visit Nico Basin again so soon?" he whined, as he trotted along after her on the wide road out of Konoha. "Couldn't we leave tomorrow? The festival is going to be over by the time we get back." He made a face, and wiped a drip from his eyes that had snuck under the brim of his rain cloak. "And why'd we have to go towards the thunder clouds?" "Honestly, ma'am, I was wondering that too," Iriko added from her other side. "We're packed awfully light for such a long trip. The old city is at least 2 days' journey, and the roads through the valley are going to be pure mud." "I am sorry, you two, but these supplies are important," she said tightly. Sasuke made an unhappy sputtering noise and dropped it, but she didn't need to be a chakra sensor to feel how resentful he was of the unexpected field trip. When his mother failed to give him a satisfactory answer, he stopped trying to keep up with her longer legs and fell back in a pout. Her maid lengthened her stride to keep up with Mikoto. "If I was the suspicious type, which I'd like you to know I'm definitely not, I would wonder why it was so important a little boy and an asthmatic civilian were chosen to fetch these supplies." "It is important," Mikoto said under her breath. "At the moment, that's all you need to know." The younger woman frowned at the sharpness of her tone and hefted her pack, hoarding her breath for the uphill climb. Mikoto turned her eyes back to the road up ahead. It was an unpleasant time of year to travel in the higher altitudes. The spring that had visited the settlements in the valley hadn't yet floated up to the mountains. The luscious blossoms promised by the peach orchards lining the mountain road were still hard, green buds. Her field of vision was dominated by an unappetizing palette of drab gray and brown, and all she could smell was trampled grass and manure. Thankfully, it hadn't taken much to persuade her husband it would be safer to have Sasuke out of the way during the operation, and to take Iriko along to keep an eye on him. She'd lied and said they were going to their vacation home in the mountains, and planned to double back once her charges were safely away to their real destinations. If something went wrong, Danzo's men would check there first, hopefully giving her maid enough time to get away and start a new life in some sleepy southern town. She'd never activated her Sharingan, and her combat abilities were limited to simple self-defense. Mikoto could only hope the mousy, but commendably loyal, young woman wasn't interesting enough for the Uchiha's enemies to expend many resources to trap her. They continued their journey in soggy silence as 6 chakra signatures steadily gained ground behind them. The poor condition of the roads had kept them from going too far from the gates, but their followers wouldn't be hindered by such mundane annoyances. Despite his foul mood, Sasuke kept pausing to look behind him, as if he could feel the eyes on his back. Good boy. He was growing sharper by the day. Her throat prickled with the pain of knowing she'd never see him realize his potential. When they passed the cultivated land, and entered a small patch of forest, the Umbu team dropped from the thick branches. Kakashi and Deus Hiroshi already knew. There was a man wearing an insectoid mask and multiple holsters of senbon that was probably Shiranui Genma, and an angular blonde man in a bear mask whose name she didn't know. Jiraiya followed a second after. He had an unconscious Naruto slung over his shoulder. Iriko shrieked, and stumbled sideways into Mikoto. Sasuke, to his credit, did not. His face had gone very white, but readied his hands to begin performing the Gokakyu nonetheless. "What did you do to Naruto?" He growled at Jiraiya, with a viciousness poorly suited to his high child's voice. The intensity of it was chilling. If you hurt him It's alright, you two. They're allies. And he's fine, Sasuke, just asleep, she said hastily, before Sasuke did something as foolhardy as launch a katon at Jiraiya. How quickly his mind snapped to thoughts of vengeance reminded her uncomfortably of herself. She put a calming hand on Iruko's back, who'd begun to wheeze in panic. Kakashi peeled the unconscious boy off of Jiraiya's shoulder, and placed him gently on the ground. Mikoto felt a small mental pop, like the bursting of a soap bubble, as he broke the genjutsu keeping him quiet. Naruto grumbled sleepily, scrubbed the fuzziness from his eyes, and looked up at Kakashi. I know you, he said, his round face lighting up in recognition, as Kakashi helped him to his feet. You helped me move my stuff into my new apartment. And I see you on the roof outside my balcony sometimes. Where are we? Did I fall asleep in the training ground again? Not this time, Kakashi answered. You're going on that little field trip Mikoto-sama told you about. Sasuke grabbed the woozy Naruto by the wrist, and pulled him over to the comparative safety of his mother's reach, still glaring at Jiraiya. Sasuke, it's all right, really. Hound, Hornet, and Sunbear are the rest of your brother's Umbu team. Badger is an old friend of mine, and also of Naruto's mother. They're here to help us. Help us what? Iruko said shrilly, as she began to fold her mind around the situation. Mikoto-sama, you don't mean to say the plan is. There will be no coup, if I've done my job, and that will have certain repercussions. The details are classified, but Naruto and Sasuke are both in terrible danger, and to a lesser degree, so are you. She slid her pack off her shoulder and dropped it at her maid's feet. I want you to go on to the abandoned city, and wait for further instructions. Sunbear will escort you. If you don't receive a message from Itachi within 2 days, run. The boys are going somewhere else, someplace safe. A look of horror was dawning across Sasuke's face. I don't want to go someplace safe, he said forcefully. I want to stay with you. I'm the best in my class, I can use the Gokakyo, I don't need. No arguments, Mikoto said. If you're a shinobi already, then you'll have to follow orders. Naruto, that goes for you too. No whining and no back talk. Both of you are very special boys, not just to me, but to Konoha. She looked up at Jiraiya. There are people out there who might try to hurt you, and if you disobey a single order your captain gives you, they might succeed. We have to go with him. Sasuke said, aghast. Naruto looked up at Jiraiya, craning his neck to do so. Who the heck are you? Jiraiya. One of the legendary Sunin, boy. Naruto snorted and then doubled over laughing. Legendary what? You totally made that up. You're not a legendary anything. I saw you getting chased down the street by a bunch of girls in bathrobes, and one of them threw her wash bucket at your butt and you fell in the canal. You're thinking of someone else. Mikoto pursed her brows but didn't correct him. So where are we going? Naruto asked. Mikoto Abakan said it was someplace cool. It's full of giant talking toads, Jiraiya replied. Oh, okay, Sasuke said, not looking very enthusiastic. And everything is made of candy, Jiraiya added. Sasuke looked at him blankly. We're kids, not total idiots. And stop that, he added, punching Naruto hard in the arm, who was practically drooling onto the shoes. At least I'm not. Jiraiya put his hands on his hips and glared down at him. Nobody likes a know-it-all. Sasuke glared right back. Right. Well. Anyway, Jiraiya mumbled, and pulled a slender scroll from a case hanging from his belt. Usually this only works if you've already signed the contract, but, rules were made for breaking. He unfurled the scroll on the ground, revealing a complex array of interlocking patterns. It looked a little like a summoning seal, although the few elements Mikoto recognized were facing the wrong direction from the blank circle in the center. Mikoto knelt down in front of the boys, and put an arm around each. I have to go now, she said, squeezing them tightly. Jiraiya-sama will take you someplace far away, where no one will be able to find you. He was a student of the Hokage, and you can trust him to protect you. Jiraiya drew a kunai from somewhere, and cut deeply into his left palm. He wet a fingertip in the pooling blood and motioned Naruto over. Stand in the middle of that. And stay still. Naruto took one look at Mikoto's face, and did as he was told. Jiraiya sketched out a small seal on his forehead and stepped back. Gross, he said, blowing some hair out of his face. Don't touch that, brat, he said, kneeling. I'm almost done with you. He placed his bloody palm on the abstract hand symbol at the edge of the scroll, and with a small puff of smoke the boy disappeared. You next. Mikoto pushed Sasuke gently in Jiraiya's direction, and he stepped reluctantly onto the scroll to have the same character painted on his forehead. She took a deep breath. I want you to know, your father and I love you very much. Both of us only wanted what was best for you. Don't ever forget that. Mom, no. He murmured, looking at her imploringly. He could tell there was something desperately wrong, and again she wouldn't be able to tell him what. She could only hope he would forgive her for her lies of omission, given time. It was a knife in her chest, the knowledge she'd never see him win his Hitaiate, a proud victory in the exam arena, perhaps even the coat of the chief of police. She'd never meet the first girlfriend he'd bring home, stand behind him at his wedding, or rock her grandchildren to sleep. All of that would pass her by, but he'd be alive. Perhaps not entirely whole, but alive. Goodbye, Sasuke, she said, as a few tears began to spill over his bravado. Jiraiya knelt and activated the reverse summoning again before Sasuke could step off, then rolled up the scroll and stowed it away. Hey, he said gruffly. None of that. I hate to see a pretty woman cry. Mikoto took a deep breath, and rubbed savagely at the tears that were threatening to fall. He clapped his palms together and looked up at her. I'll take care of them. Good luck, he said, and vanished. Sun Bear slung Mikoto's pack over his shoulder. He took several steps back from the group, then nicked his thumb on his katana and pressed his palm to the dirt. Kuchi Yasei no Jutsu, he said. There was a whirl of smoke, and an enormous bat with an elongated face and keen red eyes appeared in the road. Around its torso was a light mesh harness. It blinked in the sunlight, and yawned hugely. Oh, good. Nobody's trying to kill us. Hello, Captain, he said, nodding absently at Kakashi. Transport job, then. Ah, the blonde Umbu said. Miss, if you'll come with me. There's a cliff nearby, he can't take off from level ground if he's carrying passengers. Iriko looked back to Mikoto and bit her lip. Will I see you again? She asked. No. Probably not, Mikoto answered. On impulse, Iriko threw her arms around her. Thank you. For everything you've done for me, she whispered to the girl. She quickly let go, embarrassed by the blank white faces surrounding her, and turned to follow behind Sun Bear and his summon with her head bowed. Kakashi signaled to the others, and Genma leapt into the trees with him. Are you coming? He asked. In a moment. Don't wait up for me, she said over her shoulder. There was a slight rustle of branches as the two men disappeared. Dai's hero hadn't moved. He pulled off his mask and looped the black strap in his fist. It was a breach of protocol, but they were alone, and it wasn't as if his identity was unknown to her. It had been a long time since she'd seen his face. His features were attractive but not remarkably so, except for the red UI eyes and the unflappable good humor that could usually be seen sparkling in them. Many people found their hue unnerving, but what were crimson eyes to an Uchiha? Mikoto shivered under her rain cloak, and crossed her arms over her chest, beneath the slick material. I'm not going to see them again, she whispered. Nowhere in the historical records had Shikaku's research team found a case of a victim completely recovering from Madara's Tsukuyomi. Most lapsed into a coma and never regained consciousness. The unlucky ones did wake, their psyche shattered like porcelain, and no treatment could fill in the chips and cracks that turned familiar faces into demons and familiar streets into a terrifying labyrinth. Dai's hero. She said, her voice cracking. I'm so scared. He let the mask fall to the ground, and wrapped his arms around her shoulders, smoothing down her hair with his gloved hands. You're the bravest woman I know, he said. right alongside Kushina. In their younger days, she would have bristled at being compared to the reckless redhead, but today it was the highest of praise. Dai's hero had seen everything, helpless to aid the Hokage and his wife behind the barrier Minato had erected around themselves and the Kyuubi. Even after the demon had been ripped out of her body, Kushina had still been able to restrain it with her chakra chains. She'd allowed herself to be impaled on one of its talons, rather than see the tip score the fragile skin of her newborn son. Mikoto let her head dip until it rested perfectly against the curve of Daishiro's neck. A few cold drops from the leaves overhead joined the silent tears soaking into the fabric of his uniform. "And since I won't have the chance to say this again," he said, "I thought I'd be able to move on once you were married. But I couldn't. I tried a few times, to settle down, but it never worked out. After the third broken engagement I realized the reason I couldn't be satisfied. It wasn't any fault of theirs, but I couldn't help but compare my lovers to you. They weren't as intelligent, or as caring, or as beautiful. I watched Fugaku press the life out of you for years, and there wasn't a goddamn thing I could do about it. Watching you fade from a brilliant kunoichi to a smothered housewife was torture. You were the best out of all of us, and you knew it, too," he said, with a small, defeated-sounding laugh. "When that fire finally died, I joined Umbu because it felt like I didn't have anything left to lose. The one thing I really wanted was already gone." Her breath caught in a sob. How different things might have been if he'd been the father to her children. He would have waited until the war was over, and she was ready to begin a family. He was patient, kind, so difficult to anger. He told tasteless jokes that had made her laugh for all the wrong reasons. And he had seen, in Kakashi, the toll excellence took on small boys who were forced to grow up far too quickly. Even if she'd passed all her talents on to their children, he would have ensured they had space to be children, before they were set to a shinobi's bloody tasks. "Imagine my surprise when I learned it was you who initiated the counterinsurgency from within the Uchiha clan itself," he continued. "I discovered the woman I loved wasn't gone forever. I suppose what I'm trying to say is, if I'd known what I know now, I would have done things differently. I would have married you in a heartbeat, and given Naruto-kun the family Kushina would have wanted for him." Mikoto drew back from his embrace. As much as she wanted to stay here in his arms, they were running out of time. "I should have fought harder," she said, and swallowed hard. "I wish I had. If you'd asked, I would have said yes." She raised herself on her toes to brush her lips against his. He took her invitation and clasped her so tightly her breath was forced out in a longing sigh. The light was still on in the master bedroom of the great house. Mikoto slid open the front door, and ascended the stairs. Fugaku had donned the mail armor he rarely wore, the links glinting beneath the neck of his long coat, as he zipped it closed. He narrowed his eyes in confusion when he saw she had returned. "You should have been on your way to the summer house." "Where's Sasuke?" "He and Iriko ought to be there already," she lied. "I doubled back, because I needed to be here. With you. However this ends." He looked ready to object, but the hard line of his jaw softened. "Then stay hidden here until I call for you," he said, placing his hand heavily on her shoulder for emphasis. "The Hokage's men may retaliate, and I don't want you to be caught in it. I'll send some of my officers to protect the house." "Thank you," she murmured. "I have to go," he said, throwing on his flak jacket, and moving towards the door. "It's nearly time for the operation to begin." "Wait," she said, pulling him gently towards her by the fabric of his sleeve. She pushed herself to the tips of her toes, and pressed a kiss against his lips. It was the last one they would ever share, and what that kiss meant revolted her. "Be careful. Please." He indulged her show of affection without complaint, breathing in the perfume of her hair. "I will. For you." He stepped over the threshold of the room, and Mikoto heard the jingling of keys as he unlocked the chest in the hall closet that held his shinobi tools. While he was occupied selecting his weaponry, she used her long nails to peel off the latex barrier she'd pasted to her lips, careful not to touch the drug-impregnated surface with her fingertips. She dropped the oily scrap behind the bed frame and glanced out the window. It would be starting any moment now, and not at all in the way Fugaku had planned. As he let the lid of his weapon's chest drop, there was a scream and roar of fire from one of the grand houses further down the block. Fugaku swore, and rushed past her to their bedroom window. Umbu agents in gas masks darted in and out of the noxious yellowish cloud writhing around the windows. As he watched in horror, the same smoke erupted around another home. "We've been betrayed," Fugaku said, in a shocked voice that quickly deepened into scorching anger. "Itachi!" he snarled. Mikoto imposed herself quietly between her husband and the door. "It wasn't Itachi," she said. "At least, not wholly Itachi." Fugaku tore himself away from the scene at the window, and took a few steps toward her. "What? How do you know this?" he asked, a horrible suspicion dawning in his bearing. "Because it was me," she said dully. "That Umbu is here is my doing. From the day I learned what you were planning. The Mizukage was using you, as he was being used by none other than your precious Uchiha Madara. He planned to destroy Konoha, and you would have done it for high." In a flash of movement, he backhanded her across the face, and she stumbled backward into the banister. She let the blow connect, she deserved it, and the taste of blood that rapidly filled her mouth. Never had he struck her before, and even this was weak. He could have killed her with that one strike, if he hadn't let sentimentality get the best of him. That blow might have cowed a timid wife, but it was no way to fight against another shinobi. As she'd suspected, his hands were bound by the love he thought they'd shared. She stayed crumpled on the hallway floor, and activated her Sharingan. He was much stronger than she was, but strength was hardly everything. She spun to her feet, and opened her mouth as if to scream, kunai already in hand from the holster secreted in her skirts. The genjutsu welled up in his ears, and he flinched away from the piercing shrieks echoing inside his own head. He dispelled it quickly, and drew his tanto from the sheath at his back, but Mikoto had readied the second in those brief moments. Her eyes drank in every inconsistency in his stance. He wanted this fight over quickly, and didn't want to hurt her. He probably wasn't even aware of it yet, but the poisoned kiss was beginning to do its work. The Sharingan could process enormous quantities of information, but even the legendary dojutsu had its limits. She shattered his field of vision into a kaleidoscope of conflicting images, intensifying the dizziness that was beginning to take its toll on his balance. 3 Tomo could see through any illusion, but that information was useless if the brain was already overloaded with stimuli. He struck out at her and misjudged the distance, only barely. The enclosed space was not to her advantage. His reach was better, and if their blades locked he would overpower her. She danced out of reach, pressing down hard on the disorienting genjutsu whenever he came close to breaking it. His swipes at her were quickly becoming more awkward, and his pupils had widened almost to the ring of Tomo. His strokes were too tentative, failing at the last moment to score her pale skin, although he did manage, at last, to twist the kunai out of her grasp. His judgment was just as impaired. He had fixated on her, instead of leaving to attempt to salvage the situation outside. His equilibrium finally overcome by the drug, Fugaku stumbled backwards out of her reach and into their mirror, casting shards of glass across the floor with a shriek. He tried to rise, and fell back to his hands and knees, his eyes unfocused, as if he could barely recognize the pain of the glass that had just pierced his skin. The delirium made the victim extremely susceptible to suggestion, and distorted perception enough to make it extremely difficult to distinguish reality from illusion, even with a Sharingan. Under its influence, they stopped caring. His defenses against her had been shattered, and she could now use her genjutsu to its most devastating potential. An illusion of pain was most effective to briefly immobilize an enemy, but one of peace and pleasure was less likely to be broken. She enveloped him in a new illusion, one grounded in a shared memory. She removed the sting of the broken glass and the chill in the air, and enriched the breeze with gentle warmth and a symphony of crickets and cicadas. He was still fighting her, if weakly. Mikoto pushed harder, seeping through the cracks the drugs had opened for her. The crimson faded from his irises. She smiled down at him, the faint creases around her eyes smoothed to nothing, and her hair just brushing her chin. She sat down on the bed, cradling a tiny bundle of white quilting, bringing herself into the illusion with him. Heedless of the glass embedded in his hands and feet, he rose unsteadily and joined her. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. "Ah," he said. "Although, I'm not sure how." She smiled at his hesitancy, so rare and so sweet. Make sure you support his head, and he'll be fine. You won't break him. She lifted the newborn towards him, and waited with patient hands until the baby was settled comfortably in the crook of his elbow. Fugaku looked down at his firstborn son with a mix of apprehension and awe. Itachi worked one arm free of the swaddling, and his father met the groping fingers with his free hand. Itachi's grip tightened immediately, his tiny fingers barely meeting in a fist around his father's thumb. It was a reflex all newborns possessed, but to his father, a miracle. They looked at each other for a time, until the baby yawned and closed his eyes, drifting off safe in his father's arms. Mikoto placed her arm on her husband's shoulder, the picture of a loving family. With her other hand, she palmed another kunai from the holster strapped to her thigh. She leaned in closer, her cheek against his hair. The handle was slick with sweat. She squeezed her eyes shut, her throat constricting. She began. What was there to say? So much had gone wrong. Recriminations and apologies could never right things now. This wasn't fair, it was wrong, but peace came with a price, and Madara had forced her husband to pay it. It was the boy in his arms, now a man, that had been given the order to assassinate him. As he grew she hadn't been able to spare that baby very much, but she could at least spare him that. I loved you, she said, and thrust the point into Fugaku's neck. She channeled a burst of medical chakra and with it, overwhelming his consciousness in a split second. At least there would be no pain. He collapsed against her, and the illusion dissolved. She held him as the blood cascaded over her hands. Minutes crept by, and the current slowed. His chest stilled, and then the beating of his heart. Mikoto laid him down on the bed, and walked to the bathroom to scrub the blood from her skin. Soap and water had done very little to cleanse her of the act she'd just committed, but nevertheless Mikoto pulled on her uniform and hung the viper mask around her neck. It had a radio built around the air filter. Over the harsh sound of her breathing she opened the channel to her team. Viper, reporting in, she said, her voice flat, I have completed my secondary objective. The target has been eliminated. No witnesses. Wolf, Hound, you may commence operations. There was a brief hiss of static. Hound acknowledges, Kakashi said, and closed the channel. Wolf acknowledges, Itachi said. We'll rendezvous at the shrine. You're sure he'll come? She asked. Yes, her sons crackled. There is nothing he cares for more than vengeance. The radio buzzed once more, and was silent. Mikoto clenched her jaw so hard she felt as though her teeth might crack, and let her legs give way under her. I just murdered your father. She screamed inside of her own head. Is that all you have to say to me? She glanced at her husband. The body crumpled on the bed. The kunoichi in her noted dryly that the cupboards for the futons were the perfect size to conceal an adult male corpse. The wife was on the verge of surrendering to hysteria. With her own hands, she'd killed the man she'd slept beside for 14 years. The man whose children she'd borne. The man who trusted her. Her eyes began to burn, welling, and then overflowing with tears that soaked onto the rugs. She knew it would end this way, but, up until that very last moment, her blade against his skin, she'd denied it. She'd denied a lot of things. Despite the lies she'd told Itachi and the Hokage, not even knowing they were false, she had loved her husband once. Fugaku had been many things, arrogant, short-tempered, reactionary. What he had never been was someone she could hate. He had been kind to her, even if it was in the stifling, paternalistic way that had driven her mad when she was young. He gave her a beautiful home, and the license to keep it up as she saw fit. After Itachi was born, he rarely raised his voice to her. He loved his children. He loved his clan so much it had killed him. With the information available to him, how could anyone fault him for the decision he'd made? The coup hadn't been to selfishly secure his own power. Everything he'd done for the children of the Uchiha, to ensure they would grow up free. He hadn't even been an enemy of Konoha, not really. He wanted to purge the village of injustice. He wanted to protect it as much as any of the Hokages had done. Her eyes ached from crying, but there was no time to indulge herself in that pain. Her work was not yet over. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and tried to deactivate her Sharingan. Only, she couldn't. Chakra flowed into the irises against her conscious will, and the ache became a searing pain. She gasped and folded over against her thighs, shuddering against the urge to cry out in agony. As suddenly as it appeared, the pain faded away. She opened her eyes. Her palms were shining with tears that left a rusty streak on her breastplate when she rubbed them dry. She picked her way to a fragment of the mirror Fugaku had broken as he fell. She swept her hair from her eyes, and tilted the glass to reflect a jagged shard of her face. Two overlapping trefoils of red on black looked back at her. She recoiled from the strange new pattern in the familiarity of her Sharingan, horrified, and the red faded as her vision returned to normal. The Mangekyo. Just as the hidden text said it would appear. She threw the mirror shard against the wall, feeling defiled by this power she hadn't asked for and didn't want. She'd failed to save Fugaku, like Itachi had failed to save Shisui. Had some part of them wanted this? Were the Uchiha really this corrupted by power lust? How different, really, were she and Madara? Her breathing began to cycle faster and faster, until her head began to swim and... No. She was a Jonin of Konoha. She had a task to complete. With tremendous effort, she forced the hysteria down, and locked it tightly away with the regrets, the guilt, and the grief that were as much a mark of a shinobi as their hitaiate. She pulled the mask over her face, cinching the straps uncomfortably tight to make sure it sealed. For now, there was only the mission. Chapter 17. Warning. This chapter is what earns this FICNM rating. Let's just say Madara is a lot more creative with his Tsukuyomi than Itachi ever was. The squeamish are advised to maybe not read this while eating. Mikoto couldn't hear it, but she could sense her teammate's arrival on the tiles above her head. She swung her legs over the bedroom window frame, and dropped on the overhanging roof. The yellowish gas billowed into the night sky, obscuring the sight, if not sound, of the combat still taking place further away. The air filter on the mask was good, but not perfect. Her eyes began to prickle and water from the chemical, but it never got worse than the sting of a cut onion. Aside from Kakashi and Deus Hero, who insisted on being part of her escort team, she did not know any of these men by name, or anything about them but that she could trust them with her life. The best of Konoha usually joined Umbu, and the best of Umbu were standing here, with her. Kakashi gave the move-out signal with his right hand. The rest of the team fell into position around her, an escort formation that would shield her from attack and allow her to use her illusions to their full advantage. Most genjutsu specialists were back-of-the-line fighters, since their techniques, while momentarily disabling, couldn't cause physical damage to their opponents. Many shinobi who preferred hand-to-hand combat scoffed at their illusions for this reason, writing them off as fussy cowards and no real threat. Mikoto liked enemies with this attitude. It made them easier prey. The Naka Shrine was at the edge of the new Uchiha district that had been established after the Kyuubi leveled the sprawling clan compound near the old village center. Her team leapt from roof to roof, until one of a small group of men standing on the shingles called out to her. Although his face was concealed behind a black gas mask, she recognized his voice. It was Yuji, dressed in the utilitarian gray and black armor the police donned for high-risk engagements. 3 women were huddled on the tile, their hands and eyes bound, and a string of chakra suppression seals cinched tightly around their necks. The 2 younger ones were sobbing in pain and terror. Their mother bore the pain in silence. 2 Umbu agents stood guard over them. "I'll only be a moment," she said quietly into the radio receiver. Kakashi nodded his understanding, and called a halt. Their teammates slipped into the shadows to wait. Mikoto landed lightly on the roof across from her brother. "Do you know many of the adults joined us?" she asked. "Or at least refused to fight the Hokage's men?" "A little over half, I think. Mostly the youngest, Chunin, and below," Yuji said. It was better than she'd hoped. They were the weakest members of the clan, both physically and politically, and stood to lose the most should the coup succeed. In war, it was the Genin and Chunin that died in the greatest numbers. "We're still waiting for the reports from Team 1 and 13, he explained, but there were only 4 casualties reported so far, 1 Umbu and 3 of the rebels. Unfortunately, that included an academy student who attacked Team 5. He was clipped in the throat by a shuriken before whoever he attacked realized it was just a kid. He bled out before one of the Umbu medics could get to him. her jaw clenched. One child was still too many. Who was it? Amari's son, he answered. Make sure the Hokage gives him full honors at the funeral. He was too young to know what he was doing. Understood. I need to make the rendezvous, she said, drawing back. This isn't over yet. I know, he said, but caught her arm. Mikoto? Whatever happens tonight, you know you can count on me to look after Sasuke. Itachi too, although I don't think he needs much looking after anymore. With the mission fee, Kaname can cut back her hours at the hospital, and we've got that extra bedroom. Anything for your big sister? She asked. Anything, he echoed. Suddenly Kakashi's voice buzzed in her ear. Sorry to break this up, but we have incoming. The Uchiha assassination teams broke through our lines at the Hokage's tower. One of them was a futon user and they have a fucking hell. Distantly, through the receiver, she could hear brick shattering and a sonorous clatter, like someone had upended a load of timber into the street. Hound. She whispered fiercely. Hound, come in. She waited a few horrible moments, and his voice returned, slightly winded. Make that 2 huge centipedes. Right between us and the primary target. I'd guess they're looking for Fugaku, or for who killed him. She looked over in the direction of the village center. Something long and sinuous raised its head, silhouetted against the stars, and dove down to spear some unfortunate shinobi below. Mikoto swore. She'd already cut it too close, taking out Fugaku by herself. A delay like this and she might miss the deadline for Itachi's planned rendezvous with Madara, which would be beyond catastrophic. She'd assumed there would be a few skirmishes on the way to the Naka Shrine, but she hadn't planned for those 2 brothers on the Uchiha interception teams to summon something, let alone 2 somethings, that big. The power expenditure required for a summon that size verged on suicidal, but at this point they had nothing to lose. Death by chakra depletion shock was probably preferable to whatever the torture and interrogation force had in store for them. The creatures were closing the distance with horrifying speed. There wouldn't be any easy way around them now. A genjutsu of concealment would fare poorly against that many Sharingan, and the centipedes wouldn't be affected by it at all. They'd have to punch their way through. Tiger, Badger, stick close to Viper, and stay on the defensive. Don't get anywhere near the summons unless you have no other choice, Kakashi ordered. Everyone else, Formation 7, engage at will. Mikoto opened a channel to the rest of their team. Their bites are extremely poisonous, she informed them. If you're clipped by one, do not, I repeat, do not, delay and find yourself medical treatment. By the time the facial paralysis sets in, it's too late. You'll have suffocated by the time someone gets you to the hospital. There was a terse chorus of acknowledgement from her team members. She was intimately familiar with the effects of the venom. The colorless, bitter-smelling liquid in which she dipped her senbon had been a gift from Uchiha Ike. It was far more potent directly from the source, and killed by respiratory paralysis in less than 10 minutes. Get those 3 out of here, she ordered Yuji, gesturing at the women huddled on the roof. It will be all close combat specialists with them. You'll only get in the way. Yes, ma'am, he said, snapping the ties around their ankles, and pulling the younger ones to their feet. The old woman he lifted bodily, and leapt away to safety. The 2 agents that had been guarding them vaulted over the rooftops to join Kakashi. Mikoto paused to scout out the area with her chakra senses. The nearby houses were empty, their inhabitants already fled or arrested. She was figuratively nearsighted, far better at discerning detail at close range, but she could detect several hostile chakra signatures converging on their position, at least 7, probably 8. They were coming in a pincer formation, closing around her advance guard. I won't be any good against those summons, but I sense at least 7 or 8 men, she told her defenders. I'll take care of as many as I can from back here. While the melee fighters got into position, Mikoto linked her hands in the ram seal in preparation for her first attack. She targeted the first of the rebels as soon as she had visual contact. 3 more swift hand seals, and the signals his brain was receiving from his inner ear were delivered in a disorienting jumble. Suddenly stricken with intense vertigo, he fell flat on his face and rolled to the edge of the roof. He tried to get his footing again, and failed miserably, stumbling drunkenly over the lip with a cry. She'd done the same to the second before he hit the ground. Their balance destroyed, they wouldn't be able to take the fall properly, and they'd break bones. Maybe their necks. 2 down. 6 to go. Someone in the front line tossed out the last of his gas grenades, obscuring her view of the battle. All of her most powerful genjutsu required line of sight, and one with an area effect could too easily ensnare one of her allies. She'd done what she could. Now it was up to them. On her right, Tiger clapped his hands together, lacing his fingers, and wood sprouted from the ground where the men had fallen. The twining branches swept the 2 downed rebels off their feet, and immobilized their hands in tough wooden shackles. Mikoto did a double take. The Mokuton was supposed to have died with the Shodai Hokage. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" he asked, in the husky tenor of a teenager. "It was my understanding we were to take them alive." "No. Nothing," she said hastily. 59 babies were supposed to have died in the course of Orochimaru's experiments with Senju Hashirama's remains. That old snake was a pedant. 59 seemed like a strange number of subjects to choose. 60 was even. He would have liked even. An unearthly scream from one of the summons tore her mind away from idle speculation. It was undulating wildly, its head haloed in sparking bluish light. As she watched, a spear of it punctured the carapace, and emerged from the creature's underside. Those things had armor plating at least a finger width thick, but the jutsu had somehow punched through it twice. A figure with pale hair leapt free of the massive body, as it crashed into the cobblestones. If the second went down that quickly, they would make it. "How many men did you say there were?" Tiger asked suddenly. 8, I think, she answered. "That's what I thought you said," he said uneasily. "But my Moku Bunshin can only account for 7. She should have been able to spot someone trying to slink through the streets under a chameleon genjutsu, and an elemental affinity for earth was extremely rare among the Uchiha, so that precluded him traveling underground. She fanned her senses out again. One did sneak through. "Damn it, I can't see him," she whispered. "How did he get past?" Mikoto frowned. His chakra signature was blinking in and out, like an electric light. It felt very similar to what she could sense the handful of times she'd tried sparring with Minato, and there was only one person on the assault team who could use a jutsu even vaguely similar to his signature technique. With Shisui dead, he was a contender of the title for the most dangerous fighter among the Uchiha. Deus Hero took note of the way her hands tightened on the roof ridge, and sighed. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" he quipped. The more flippant Deus Hero got, the more scared he really was. "It's Uchiha Hire," Mikoto said. "I'm sure of it. He has a Jakuken jutsu that allows him to phase briefly through solid objects. He must be traveling through the houses. I served with him in Iwa. And I remember him being a fanatic about his blast goggles." "No gas grenades?" "Shit," he said, looking away. "I'll take him. He's probably figured out we're protecting you for a reason." "Going against an Uchiha 1-to-1 and at close range is suicide," Tiger said. "I'm coming with you. Don't be stupid. You'll stay here," he commanded the younger man, glancing at Mikoto. "I know how to fight a Sharingan. I'll be all right." Mikoto locked her jaw to keep the tearful objections lodged in her throat. It was true that he'd come up with a few tricks over the years to foil her eyes in the training field. But he'd still lost half of those matches, and they hadn't been against a melee combat specialist. Badgers were truly vicious creatures when you crossed them, tireless and brave and willing to attack predators much larger and stronger than themselves. If their homes were in danger, they would battle bears. She could only hope Deus Hero was going to live up to his codename. "Try to draw him out with one of your Moku Bunshin. I need room to maneuver." "Teiko," he said, lapsing back into her old title, "please, guide me." Without waiting for an answer, he jumped to the ground. Tiger held out his right hand, and the flesh beneath his gloves began to writhe. What she realized was wood seemed to pour out of his arm, and take shape into a perfect duplicate of his body, albeit one with a very odd texture to its clothing and hair. The Moku Bunshin swung itself down against one of the pillars of the house, and melted into the wood grain without a trace. The whole procedure was both fascinating and repulsive, and Mikoto could see immediately why Orochimaru wanted this nature transformation so badly. Its usefulness as a tool of espionage and assassination would be unparalleled. From the street, a thick darkness began to bubble up like oil, from where Deus Hero had landed. It climbed to the rooftops in a cloud that encompassed half the small block, lapping against her ankles in its own rhythm, and undisturbed by the breeze. She could see but not feel it. She knew from experience it could not be burned or blown away, and no flares or flash grenades could pierce it. This nature transformation consumed light itself, using the energy provided by an enemy's attempt to dispel it to grow ever larger. The first time Deus Hero had used it on her, even in its flawed, experimental form, it had given her claustrophobic nightmares for days. In the 15 years since, it seemed he'd perfected it. There was a crash from below, and then the erratic sounds of steel on wood as a handful of kunai flew and missed. It was going to be a game of stealth now, although their side had a significant advantage in her sensory abilities. A low groaning sound rose from beneath them, and several of the houses lurched on their foundations. That would probably be Deus Hero using a Doton to reshape the terrain, and confuse the Uchiha's environmental awareness even further. She whispered direction as he closed in. There was the keening of more blades sailing through the air, and someone grunted sharply as one struck flesh. Crazed laughter filtered up from the intangible, Enkimuk. "You think I'm afraid of the dark, Umbu?" he called, his voice harsh with pain. Deus Hero must have taken first blood. Her teammate didn't justify this with an answer of any kind. It would be a Bunshin, trying to soak up his reserve kunai. The single enemy chakra signature below split into 6, guessing correctly one of the Umbu team had a sensor with them. Mikoto punched the switch embedded in the mask. "There are solid ones out there now," she warned him. "5 of them. I'm not going to be much help to you anymore." He didn't reply, for fear of giving away his position. His opponent's real body could be anywhere, and Deus Hero would have to find it by process of elimination. There were 2 pops as the air rushed in to fill the space previously occupied by Hirai's Kage Bunshin. He got lucky on the third, and steel struck steel for a few brief moments. Hirai cursed, and then the silence returned. It stretched out into seconds, then minutes. The others were still occupied with the second summon, and however many Uchiha were with it, there would be no reinforcements. It wasn't until Mikoto's chest was burning that she realized she wasn't breathing. Their enemy's voice surfaced again, from the street behind her this time. "Do you think I don't know who you are? We were in the same platoon for 9 months. Grand old times. It's alright if you don't remember me, though, I won't take it personally. You were always too busy with that two-faced little slut sitting on the roof to spend much time with us boys in the barracks." Mikoto went stiff. He must have recognized her jutsu when she'd used it on his 2 companions, just like she had recognized his, and his guess was confirmed by the obvious presence of a sensor type. His target had never been Deus Hero. This whole time, he'd been getting in position to deal with her. "Fugaku-sama did this for your children, you ungrateful bitch!" he shrieked. "Shit, tiger spat." He knocked her down against the tiles, and frantically erected a conical barrier of heavy wood around both of them. The planks locked just as a dull roar and a whirlwind of fire came screaming up from the street. The concussive force was enough to rip free parts of the overhanging roof, and send shards of ceramic splintering into the air with a sound like a hailstorm. Mikoto bit back a scream as the roof beams beneath their feet lurched, crackling ominously from the additional weight of the wooden wall. Tiger's barrier began to smoke, and a red glow seeped through the seams in the planks. They were trapped. He dropped to his knees, and forced more wooden supports into the house, trying desperately to shore up the collapsing structure long enough to allow them to weather the firestorm. After what felt like an eternity, the 3 extra chakra signatures disappeared. Hirai's Kage Bunshin had burned themselves out. "It's over," she said. "Drop us down into the house, and I'll have 2 Kage Bunshin scatter as soon as you release the wall." "Got it," he gasped, breathless from the strain of keeping the house standing. A hole opened in the crisscrossing branches beneath their feet, letting in a puff of black smoke. "Let me douse the fire, I'll go first." He lowered himself down using a self-made ladder, prodding the floor gingerly to be sure the damaged structure could support his weight. Satisfied, He used a few hand seals to draw a fine rain from the broken pipes, and signaled for her to descend. Even with the protection of their air filters, breathing was difficult. The air she sucked in left her lungs aching with heat, and hungry for more. If they stayed here long they would both suffocate. She followed him, leaving behind two Kagebunshin crouched under the dome. One transformed itself into tiger, and the other performed a genjutsu of its own, with its creator as the target. Mikoto experienced a brief moment of double vision, as what the Bunshin was seeing with its right eye became what she was seeing as well. She covered her left with her glove to let herself focus. "What are we going to do?" Tiger asked, panting. "I don't have much chakra left, and there's no way in hell I can take him down hand to hand." She had an idea, but one or two details needed to be confirmed first. "Do you have one last Moku Bunshin left in you?" If I'm right, that's all you're going to need." "Let the wall go," she ordered him. "I'll explain, he's busy with my duplicates." Tiger put his hands together, and she could hear the heavy dome shatter outward. Her clones leapt out, covered by the rain of splinters. The one still wearing her face executed a graceless somersault, and landed heavily on the least damaged portion of the roof. The other, disguised poorly as Tiger, drew out a handful of kunai in quick succession. Two of the three passed harmlessly through Hirei's body, to clatter against the roof tiles of a neighboring house. The third he dodged, a quick side slip that was almost impossible to see without a Sharingan. The time limit for his phasing was only a second. Promising. She watched the embers fouling the air closely, as the false tiger completed the arc, finding his footing with considerably more finesse than the first clone. The sparks had drifted through Hirei's face and torso, but settled on his sandals. More promising yet. He couldn't make his entire body insubstantial at once or he'd fall clear through whatever surface he was standing on. Hirei lazily tossed a few shuriken in the direction of the false tiger, which disappeared with a pop as it failed to evade the last one. Daishiro's efforts hadn't been in vain. The man was bleeding heavily from a deep gash in his thigh and another at his hairline, the blood flowing around the blast goggles cinched against his face and soaking into his collar. "Is that all you can muster, you whore?" he snarled. "Not everyone in Konoha agreed you were the wonder child Seikomo always believed you were. Some of us were placing bets on how many jonin it took you to fuck your way to a promotion." The real Mikoto let the insults wash over her dispassionately, although her clone seemed to be having a more difficult time controlling itself. Hirei hadn't changed much since they'd been stationed at the same outpost in the war. His conversation was as revolting as she'd remembered. He didn't confine his beastly nature to insults, either. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances 3 years ago, a civilian woman of whom Mikoto had been rather fond. Despite what she felt was overwhelming evidence the woman had been battered to death, the police took care of their own, and the investigation quietly faded. This was one man the Uchiha would be better off without. "Go, now," she signaled to Tiger, and drew the katana from the sheath on her back. He nodded, and melted silently into the floor. His last surviving Moku Bunshin raised its arms high, and stretched them to reach the ceiling beams. It merged into the wood and disappeared. "How dare you!" her Bunshin screamed above her head. "If you kill me the Hokage will." "Will what?" He laughed, coming closer. She paced backward with every step he took, until her real body was just under and behind his. He pushed the Bunshin down, and swung a kunai into his left hand, stilling its feeble attempts to fight back. He crouched, and slid its mask aside with the knife's point, running his hands roughly over her face and neck. "I'm a dead man already," he whispered. "All I want is the pleasure of seeing you squirm under me a little before I die. But first." He cocked his head, so he would just be able to make out the real tiger emerging from another roof. He threw out what looked like a swarm of shuriken with his free hand. Most of them were illusory, but a few were solid, and glowing faintly blue in her enhanced sight. "Tiger, move!" her Bunshin screamed, too late. As Hirei had predicted, Tiger had chosen to stand his ground, and rely on his Mokudan for defense. As impressive as his elemental mastery was, he was still inexperienced, and predictable. Most of the projectiles dissolved as they struck the wooden beams he summoned around himself, but one tore through and into his upper arm, sharp enough to bite into bone. I needed to take care of you, boy, Hirae finished. Tiger let out a choked scream, and fell against the tangle of beams that had sprouted from the roof on which he stood, clutching the gaping wound the chakra-enhanced shuriken left in its wake. The real Mikoto grit her teeth. He was lucky. A little to the left and he would have lost that arm. A pair of hands emerged from the tangled mess of wood beneath Hirae, and grabbed him by the waist. He glanced behind him, unimpressed. Mikoto-san, kill him. The Moku Bunshin cried, as its face surfaced from the wood. He grinned down at her double's shocked expression. Useless woman. Mikoto released the split-vision genjutsu her double had placed on her, just as Hirae dropped the kunai and brought his hands together for the single seal he required to face. In 1 second, the velocity of a falling human body would place the heart exactly there. Her Sharingan guiding the thrust with perfect precision, Mikoto took a single step forward, and buried her sword nearly to the hilt in his insubstantial ribcage. His technique released, flesh and bone solid again, and he looked down at the pristine blade protruding from his chest. For once in his life, it seemed Uchiha Hirae had nothing to say. Understand how I made Jonin now? She whispered, and wrenched her sword free as he crumpled to the ground. She left him there to gasp out his last pitiful breaths, and picked her way out of the remains of the smoldering house. The second centipede she couldn't see, it seemed to have gone down while she and Tiger dealt with Hirae. She felt stupid and slow, like her head was packed with cotton down. She'd stayed in the thin and smoky air too long, and the oxygen deprivation was getting to her. Mikoto shook her head to clear it, and felt a piece of plastic slap against her neck. Her radio earpiece. It must have come loose when Tiger knocked her down. She replaced the coil of plastic, and winced at the volume of Kakashi's frantic calls in the receiver. "Viper here," she responded, her voice harsh with smoke. Tiger took a bad hit, almost severed his arm. "I'm not hurt, but..." Deus hero. Panic welled up in her head, so quickly she felt like she was drowning in it. She leapt into the street, following the faded echoes of his chakra signature. The darkness had almost steamed into nothing, and as it dissipated the aftermath of Hirae's firestorm was revealed. The ground was rent and blackened, the fire gnawing hungrily at the panels of the ruined houses. She turned sharply around the corner, and found Deus Hero motionless in the midst of it, half buried in rubble and his mask broken. The remains of an earthen wall smoldered around him. This was far beyond her ability to heal, but she forced chakra into her hands anyway. "Mikoto!" Kakashi called, from above her head. He landed beside her, and roughly tore her hands away. "What the hell are you doing?" she snarled. "I could ask the same of you." "You're not the team medic and you have 9 minutes, he said, not letting her go. "This was the reason the Hokage assigned the clan head's assassination to Itachi. You've been off active duty for too long. Lock it down, or the mission is blown and we are all dead." "I can't," she mouthed. He was right. She knew he was right, from the moment she'd stepped out of the Hokage's office, but, how could she abandon Deus Hero now? She hadn't been able to do a thing to prevent Kushina's death, or Tsukumo-sensei's. Circumstances had forced her away from both their sides, and she couldn't even give them the comfort of a friend's hands on their own as their lives bled away. "We don't have room for any more mistakes," Kakashi said fiercely, as if he could read the thoughts tumbling around in her head. "What Deus Hero did, he did to give you the chance to save Konoha. Don't let that go to waste. And he's Umbu. We take care of our own. As soon as you're inside the shrine, I'll make sure they put the best medic we've got on his surgical team." She nodded mutely, almost beyond grief. Kakashi set off first, at a dead run, and 2 more members of the escort team fell into stride with him. "There is only the mission," she repeated to herself as the roofs flew by beneath her feet. "Only the mission." The escorts left her at the door of the Naka shrine, vanishing into the trees to tend to their wounded as soon as she was safely delivered to her destination. Its acting captain remained on the stone pathway. Mikoto stopped with one fist clenched on the door handle. "If there's something you wanted to tell me, make it quick." Madara told Itachi the destiny of the Uchiha is hatred, that there's no place in your hearts for anything else, he said. "That is the most fucking insulting thing I've heard in my entire life. I want your face to be the last thing he ever sees, and when he dies, I want him to know how wrong he was. She glanced over her shoulder, but he was already gone. They could waste no more time. Mikoto pulled open the doors, and stepped inside. It wouldn't do her any good, but she drew the katana from its sheath simply to feel the weight of a weapon in her hand. She pulled the mask off, and tossed that aside. It cracked and broke in half upon impact with the floor. She waited. The shutters were closed and the torches unlit. It was dark and utterly still. A breath of wind blew through the airless room, and then, standing before the altar, was a man. The technique was perfect in its simplicity. No smoke, no flash, no bang. He wasn't there, and then he was. Madara was swathed in a heavy black cloak, and wore a white mask licked with flame. His hair was long, cut ragged like a lion's mane, and as black as it had been when he was young. His back was unbent by the weight of those long years. She had never felt an aura so strong and so malevolent emanating from a human being. It seemed to freeze the very air in her lungs, prickle over her skin like a spider's legs. He stepped down the 3 stairs to face her. "You," he said with a tinge of amusement, "are not Itachi?" "I am Uchiha Mikoto," she answered, and to her horror her voice trembled. "We cast you out, Madara. You shouldn't have returned." He laughed, the chilling sound echoing off his mask. "He lost his nerve, and sent his mother in his place. The Uchiha have become even more gutless than I remembered them to be." "You're mistaken," she said. "I chose to be here, because he's my son, and the Uchiha will need him. The coup failed and the council is dead. The taint you left on us is cleansed." "That's very touching," he said, mocking, but this will of fire nonsense was getting old when Hashirama was still alive. "I intend to snuff it out, and return the Uchiha to their true path." "They wouldn't follow you then, and they won't now," she said. He clicked his tongue against his teeth, like she was a particularly dense and obstinate schoolgirl. "That remains to be seen," he said offhandedly. "You do know why I'm here, do you not? I will bring the Uchiha back to their true path, however few of them may remain alive to walk it." He took another step forward. Mikoto could feel herself shaking with the effort of just standing her ground. "But since I am on something of a schedule, I do have one question for you. You're letting the fox kid suck at your teat, are you not? If you tell me where he is, I may be amenable to sparing a few of your favorite Uchiha. You have one more brother, if I'm not mistaken. I believe I killed 2 of them already, but I am getting on in years, and my memory slips now and then. There are so many corpses to keep track of." Rage erupted from Mikoto's heart, the flames briefly obscuring her fear, and eating at her edges of her promise to Itachi. Madara would pay for insulting their memories. Her hand tightened on the grip of the katana, and a shiver went down the length of the blade before she got hold of herself again. "As you were saying," he said. She could imagine the smug smile beaming at her, from behind that mask. "Naruto's gone," she said. "Somewhere you'll never find him." "That is, unlikely," he answered. "But, since I came all the way back to this horrible place, I think I deserve some compensation for my trouble. Leaving Konoha empty-handed wouldn't be very fair, now would it?" He shook his head slightly. "I started too late with Itachi. Pity. But it was considerate of you to give me a spare, if the first one turned out defective." The rage was pounding in her chest, her temples, circulating around her body with every beat of her heart. He dared to threaten her sons. As far as she was concerned, Itachi was the finest shinobi the clan had ever produced, and not because of how deft a warrior he was. And Sasuke, he would never get his hands on Sasuke. She'd slit his throat first, ear to ear, or, no. Better yet, she'd take off his whole head and let the Uchiha Ravens have their fun with his ill-gotten eyes. What do you think, Perhaps little Sasuke will fare better under my gentle tutela." She screamed and charged him, arching her blade across his unprotected neck. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Mikoto stumbled through the strike as her body passed right through his insubstantial cloak, all her muscles ready to encounter a resistance that wasn't there. She recovered her balance on the steps, and whipped around, breathing hard. "That was rude, I wasn't finished," he scolded. "Respect your great-grandfather, Mikoto-chan." She was so angry she could barely see. Her tongue was too leaden to form meaning more sophisticated than a snarl. Her hand tensed on the grip of the katana until her knuckles were screaming, and the pain brought her back. The mission. There was only the mission. If she lost her head now, it would be over. Every sacrifice would be in vain. She knew he was a manipulator, like Itachi and like herself, and she'd let him in without a fight. They had never met, and he already knew exactly how to make her lose control. He didn't try to threaten her own life, or intimidate her. He made her feel like the elders had made her feel, weak and useless, unworthy of the regard even one enemy gives another. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Some stupid, irrational part of her craved Madara's respect, and he was exploiting this to its fullest potential. The men that truly mattered, Itachi, Dai's hero, Kakashi, and the Hokage, they'd already given it to her freely. Mikoto forced herself to even out her panting breaths. She'd made a promise, and there was no vengeance here for her to take. Hashirama Senju and Namikaze Minato hadn't been able to kill Madara on their own, and they were cages. "I won't negotiate with you," she said dully, and tossed the sword aside with a clatter. "There is nothing you can offer that I will betray Konoha to possess." He snorted. "Then why are you here, exactly?" "No, never mind, don't tell me. Tracking the Jinchuriki down myself is merely inconvenient, not impossible. And your sanctimonious babbling is starting to irritate me, which was a poor choice on your part. I asked nicely, but I can take what I need from you just as easily." "I'm not afraid to die," she whispered. "Oh, my dear child, there are worse things." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw two Kagebunshin coalesce out of the shadows, and felt a surge of gut-freezing panic. That was impossible. They were counting on Madara to be defenseless. He'd explicitly told Itachi he could not split his chakra and still retain enough to perform the Tsukuyomi. She tried to swallow, and almost choked on her terror. She'd been wrong. Madara had lied. Madara lied so easily, and so often, the taste of the truth would probably make him gag. She was a fool to think he would have entrusted a student as intractable as Itachi with all of his secrets. He had less than 3 seconds. The clones of Madara would devour everyone. Then he would kill Itachi, the traitor, then her, and who knows how many other Uchiha before he could be stopped. Even if he was forced to flee today, he would never stop hunting Sasuke and Naruto. There was no guarantee the village could protect them, or even if they would accept that protection. Both took after their mothers far too much. Naruto was brave to the point of foolhardiness. He would never sit idly by while others died for his sake, no matter what the consequences. And Sasuke, that bully in the schoolyard, Jiraiya with an unconscious Naruto slung over his shoulder, if someone he loved was killed, he was going to demand a price in blood, rivers, and rivers of it. It didn't matter how stupid it was, or how much exacting that vengeance might hurt. If Madara killed the people Sasuke loved most in the entire world, he wouldn't even have to search. Sasuke would come to him. The wood paneling of the shrine crisped and disintegrated like burning paper. Cold metal emerged from the ground to encircle her wrists and ankles. Mikoto found herself chained to a cross, beneath a sky gone Sharingan crimson. Madara had taken the bait. Oh, God. Mikoto bit down on her lip to keep a sob locked in her chest. This mission had been doomed from the start. He was going to rip out her mind, and then he was going to do his best to burn Konoha to the ground. Her sacrifice was meaningless. She had to get out. Driven by panic, she stilled her chakra flow, and then brought it back in a rush. The illusion didn't even flicker, it was as useless as she had been warned. The world was so real she could feel the grain of the wood catch on the fabric of her sleeves, smell the promise of lightning from the storm clouds roiling overhead. Madara coalesced in front of her, from the hot winds blowing across the featureless plain. "This is the power of the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan," he said. From within his voluminous cloak he drew out a katana. "Everything here is under my control. Not only time, but space, and matter as well. Anything I wish to do to you, I can, and I will." The steel glinted red under the clouds. He raised the tip of the blade to her jaw, a delicate caress. Its point traced the line of her cheekbone, and paused for a moment. She screamed as it pierced her eye, and he twisted. He wrenched the blade free and struck a second time, blinding her completely. She struggled against the chains, bloodying her wrists in futile attempt at escape. "That's of no use," he replied with amusement. 5 seconds. He worked the tip of the sword under the straps of her breastplate, and snapped them one by one until the front hung loose, exposing the fabric of her undershirt. He split it neatly down the center, from her navel to her collarbone. Then, he did the same to the skin beneath. Every stroke was that of a master artist, born of long practice. Her pride trickled away as the blood streamed down her body, into the thirsty dust. She begged for him to stop, screaming out empty promises. 1 minute. "You are what I knew would be born from an alliance with the Senju, so soft, so weak, so helpless," he said over her sobbing breaths. "The Tsukuyomi can be overcome. Did you know that? Blood calls to blood. A Sharingan of the same lineage as my own is enough to free you of this pain." He placed the tip of his katana against the raw, exposed bone where her clavicles met. "Well, perhaps not you. You can't even find purchase for your little kitten claws." The steel cut through flesh and bone without resistance, exposing her beating heart. She should have been long dead from the damage her body sustained, but that sweet release had fled. 3 minutes. He lowered his blade to inspect his handiwork. He cocked his head and sighed, as if he found it wanting. With a gesture, the ruin he had made of her torso knit itself back together, and the agony faded. "You should have embraced your hatred, Mikoto-chan. It would have served the clan far better. As it is, you ruined the first Uchiha since myself, who could have taken back the legacy of the Rakudo Sennin, and you were well on your way to ruining the second. But the Uchiha and the Senju are destined to do battle. There is no other truth." "What legacy?" she choked out. The Rakudo Sennin had been dead 1,000 years, if he even lived at all. There was nothing to take from a man made of myths and legends. "One can learn many things, speaking with the Biju," he said. "You lack faith. He did walk this earth, once. He was real enough to father 2 sons. We Uchiha are descended from the eldest. The strongest. The rightful heir. The Senju are descended from the younger. The one who wormed his way into his father's favor, despite his weakness. He gave each of his sons a gift, you see. He gave us his power. And then he gave the Senju his love." He spat out the word disdainfully. When the sage was on his deathbed, he named the younger son as his heir. Madara raised his blade again. "That was a mistake. The eldest knew it. He almost succeeded in killing his brother. I intend to finish the job for him." "It was no mistake," Mikoto whispered hoarsely. He placed the tip of his katana against the soft skin beneath her jaw, and thrust it clear through the muscle and severed her tongue. "You don't know when to shut up, do you, girl?" he said, laughing as she gagged on the torrent of blood filling her mouth. He attacked again and again, until time stopped and only pain and her weakening screams remained. After hours, days, the torture ceased. She opened her eyes, again whole and unmarred. Her tormentor was nowhere to be seen. The chains holding her in place uncurled, dropping her to the ground, her legs folding beneath her. Her uniform and the skin beneath were unblemished. Had Itachi somehow done it? Had they won? But if so, why was she still here? "Mom!" A voice called out to her, high and childlike. She hadn't heard that voice in years. It should have been deeper, duller, sapped by years of suffering under his father's expectations of what a shinobi ought to be. "Itachi!" She mouthed into the dust, too weak to rise. Light footsteps approached her prone body. He knelt beside her, and brushed a lock of hair from her forehead. His fingers were gentle, chamois soft, and uncalloused from the years of punishing training. It had been a decade since. She remembered now. Since Itachi had changed. When he used to take her hand without a thought. Laugh. Play. Taller than most, and skilled beyond his years, the other children were intimidated by him, but he made the effort to pull a few into his games anyway. He'd cared then. His speech had a more mature cadence, and he was surer on his feet than his playmates, but he'd wanted what any other child wanted: his parents' affection and friends to call his own. There was enough strength left in her to turn her head, wasn't there? Itachi smiled down at her, his round face resting on his knees. Then the childlike smile split a little too wide, like the grin of a wolf before it lunged. His eyes went crimson, and from the sockets Madara's Sharingan whirled into eternity. Steel cables erupted from the ground, encircling her limbs and torso. They drew him up, too, so Madara could look her in the eye from the body of her child. "No," he said mockingly, in Itachi's younger voice. The cables tightened like serpents encircling their prey, the bones in her arms splintering under the pressure. She screamed anew. Her vision blurred with tears of pain and helplessness. Was there no end to this? Could he keep her here forever? Madara allowed the steel snakes burrowing hungrily into her chest to withdraw, a brief respite that made anticipation of the next wave all the more horrifying. Through bleary eyes, she looked up at false image of her son. She'd convinced him to take this path. Itachi's death was on her hands. The destruction of the whole village was on her hands. Konoha would be shattered. Perhaps not now, but soon enough. Madara would slaughter every mother's son and daughter within the walls, in his insane lust for vengeance. After today, he would never again be caught unaware, and he would not be stopped without enormous loss of life, if he could be stopped at all. Her children needed her. They all did. She couldn't let it slip away. Mikoto coughed against shattered ribs. Maybe she still had a chance. All she needed to do was give Itachi a few more precious seconds, and trust that it wouldn't be in vain. He was the best shinobi of his generation, the best born within Konoha's walls since Minato. He would make good use of her parting gift. All this time, she had been shrinking from the illusory pain, convincing herself it wasn't real, trying futilely to break what was unbreakable out of pure instinct. What if that was the wrong path? Madara had said blood called to blood in the world of Tsukuyomi, offering the only hope of freeing oneself. She was Madara's direct descendant, and didn't have the strength to break the genjutsu, but brute force had never been what had won her past battles. The ability to flow like quicksilver around her enemies' defenses, to turn their own strength and overconfidence against them, that was what had won her the envy of her peers. He had probably used this jutsu 100 times, or more, in his long life. Maybe it was unbreakable. She squeezed her eyes shut, and opened them again, looking out through the trefoil of her own Mangekyo Sharingan. Their eyes locked, and Madara hesitated. No one in history had ever had the audacity to turn his own technique on him. No one else could. The moment of doubt was so brief, even her well-trained Sharingan almost missed it. It meant he was afraid. It meant he wasn't invulnerable. It meant that she could win. She poured her chakra into this world of the mind, probing every possible weakness of the cables Madara had drawn from the ground to restrain her. The crushing pressure lessened a fraction, and some of the shrieking pain in her bones began to fade as he was forced on the defensive, if ever so briefly. She pushed harder, bringing more of herself into the illusion and making it her own. The metal supporting Madara's borrowed form shuddered and snapped, and the thinner strands began to twine themselves around him. The thing before her was not her son. She screamed again, not in agony but in defiance. She began tearing at the life faster than he could repair it, and his form shifted nauseatingly. More steel vines erupted from the ground below him, twining around him just as fast as he could snap the ones she'd trapped him with moments before. Both of them were submerged in a nightmarish, writhing garden of steel cable. She didn't have the strength to free herself, but she didn't need it. If she couldn't leave, neither would Madara. He may have been older and stronger, but she had one advantage. Madara was patient, seemingly immortal. He had nothing to fight for but old grudges, and he couldn't savor that vengeance if he was dead. He was used to biding his time, withdrawing if he must, and thus was unused to bringing his full power to bear. That was not true for Mikoto. Everything she fought for would continue, even if her victory meant her death. With luck, Itachi, Sasuke and Naruto would live on, grow up, and have children of their own. Konoha would weather the Uchiha's betrayal like it had weathered so many other catastrophes, and rise again like the phoenix from the ashes of the shinobi who had given their lives to protect it. Through the tears, she smiled, and redoubled her efforts to bind the foe before her. Madara snarled at her, the first sound of distress she had heard from his throat. It may have been the blurriness of her vision, but it seemed as though the edges of the illusion were starting to fade into a dirty mist. They remained locked in this battle of wills for what felt like hours but was merely seconds. She drew on her chakra stores without care for her own life, dipping into the reserves that he could not, the energy that sustained her body's cells, her organs, and her muscles. Young shinobi were trained diligently to watch themselves for the symptoms of such overuse: extreme fatigue, dizziness, and confusion followed by loss of consciousness. If the depletion was severe enough, their organs would begin shutting down system by system, until finally their hearts grew too fatigued to beat. Very soon after that, the damage to the brain was irreversible, no matter how skilled the medic, and death was a certainty. The body guarded itself against such an extreme, robbing a shinobi of their wits long before most reached the point of no return. In this prison of the mind, such safeguards had been removed. Mikoto couldn't win fight, but she didn't have to. She only had to hold on, tenacious as a crocodile, until suddenly, Madara's body went rigid, as if he'd been struck. Their world rippled, a stone dropped into a pool of still water. "You planned this, you bitch!" he screamed. Mikoto could barely hear his increasingly incoherent curses. The red sky melted away, and she was in the shrine once more, with solid wood beneath her feet. Her face was slick with blood, not her own, and the air smelled of charred flesh and an unnatural acrid fire. Everything was going black, beckoning her into oblivion. She felt a pair of arms catch her as her legs gave way, hold her tight against his chest. It was done. That's it for part 5. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.